this play has many dimensions, about many things. It's a personal story, it's a family story, it's a historical narrative, it's a deep and profound psychological narrative about a trauma survivor's journey, which has universal meaning for all those who've been traumatized in any way. And it also has an archetypal and transpersonal element in the way the protagonist, Patty, survives and transcends the multiple ways people abuse her and misinterpret her and misrecognize her journey and misname her. One of the beauties of this play is that it really honors the humanity and subjectivity of every single one of the people involved, including the so-called villain. And that's a really rare thing for a play to be able to do. It honors the pain and suffering of the parents, the loss of a child, the confusion of parents. When a child goes through an identity alteration, which many parents who've had children who've gone into religious cults or other kinds of political groups who make a radical change in their identity, either through voluntary or coerced or traumatized methods. So there's that universal aspect of the play. But what moves me most is the honoring of one trauma survivor's journey through the landscapes of abduction, terror, mind control, brutal assault on her mind, body, and spirit, and the coerced identity alteration, her becoming Tanya, which was the name that she was given or that she took after she went through a very brutal breakdown of her personality. A new personality who was constructed that would go along with the organization, the criminal political organization that she was held hostage in. And then after her ordeal, the way in which society used her and abused her is pretty classic for the way many vets, rape victims, people who've been in criminal cults, or people who've been trafficked, or people who've been in criminal family systems all have to survive these unbelievable assaults on their core sense of self. And so, above all things, the play is really a hero's journey of a trauma survivor who's been misunderstood, misrecognized, and whose journey back to hold on her own dignity and integrity in the face of unbelievable assaults, individual, collective, societal, the legal system, the psychiatric establishment at the time, multiple betrayals and multiple assaults and multiple re-traumatizations of a trauma survivor. And somehow through it, Patricia Hearst held on to her own integrity, which many, many, many trauma survivors I've worked with through the years, and scores that I've known, managed in the most unbelievably impossible conditions, like concentration camp survivors talk about, Elie Wiesel wrote about, Viktor Frankl wrote about. Hold on to an essential part of the soul or self that was not taken hostage or betrayed. And that's one of the most magnificent parts of this play. And one thing that makes this story different is that, unlike some people who get involved in movements through their own choice, and maybe they can get caught up in something that they didn't realize just how involved the saying yes to that group was. Patty was abducted, and the way many child soldiers throughout the world are abducted and taken into captivity and subjected to massive amounts of coercive influence and indoctrination, then they make a so-called choice. And this is where the big issue of free will comes into play. And I think psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals have been debating, trying to understand the issue of free will and free choice in trauma survivors for the past 50 to 100 years. And I think one of the beauties of this play is that it really honors the nuance, subtlety, and complexity of the trauma survivor struggle with issues of free will. It also makes us all, as a society, have to look at the issue of free will, what it means to have free will. Do certain people who we think have free will really have free will, or do we project that upon them? Women who are trafficked in prostitution throughout the world, people treat them as if they've made a choice. There are conditions in which we don't really have the freedom to influence our lives in the way that we would like to. And I think that those people tend to be relegated to a marginalized position in society and denigrated, because people like to hold on to this fantasy that no matter what, no matter what the conditions are, although no trauma survivor holds on to this fantasy, no matter what the conditions, we would all do the right thing. We would never betray ourselves. We would never hurt another person. We would never do anything to protect ourselves at the expense of another. We would always find a way out. I think this play really empathically and compassionately portrays that dilemma, both in Patty Hearst's life, but in the universal dilemma that many, many people and almost all trauma survivors find themselves in, where they have to give up a piece of themselves in order to save the whole of themselves. And that, I think this play really brings a level of psychological sophistication and empathy, compassion, and artistry to understanding these elements of the human condition, especially the human condition under traumatic conditions. And I will say, although there's been a huge movement in the past 10 or 20 years to have the trauma survivor story enter the public domain, like through films and TV shows and through theater, this particular portrait of a trauma survivor has never, ever been done before. Not with this level of narrative complexity, sensitivity, and realism, and depth of respect for all of the unique subjectivities of all the characters. One of my favorite parts about the play is that the author does not let anyone off the hook in the audience to project and polarize good and bad in a very simplistic way. And even the so-called villain of the story is portrayed at a certain point with wisdom and compassion, so that even some of his struggles to bring about social change and personal dignity and self-respect, and to transform his own pain through collective action, is rendered understandable and accessible. And by making the villain of the story part of ourselves, the author of this play has made sure that we don't project or polarize or dichotomize in any kind of simplistic solution, and we're left really holding a much wider angle lens on the human condition. Patty was a victim, then she became an alleged perpetrator, then she was victimized by the society, by the legal system, by the psychiatric system, and by the criminal justice system, and then by the masses of people who, again, as I said earlier, wanted her to be a hero or a villain, all the time completely eviscerating her subjectivity and having absolutely no sensitivity to the subtlety and nuance and complexity of her own suffering and her own attempt to hold on to her own self under extremely devastating, desperate, traumatic conditions. One of the things I really appreciate about this play is that although it honors this one individual journey and makes us all deal with our own confusions around free will and trauma and what we would do in a situation like that, it does raise consciousness about the dilemmas of survival and post-traumatic survival for all people who've either been traumatized in violence and sexual violence, or who had to commit, who've been trained to kill or commit crimes as part of their indoctrination or as part of their traumatic indoctrination. There's a form of trauma that's not really well understood. I refer to it as coerced perpetration trauma. That is the kind of trauma that turns people into perpetrators as part of the essential traumatic setup. In other words, we usually think of trauma and victimization. People are victims of crime or victims of rape, or people are harmed in some way, betrayed or violated. But coerced perpetration trauma, which is the central organizing piece of Patty Hearst's trauma narrative, is when the trauma also involves, aside from being victimized, also involves, through various forms of indoctrination and mind control and group coercion and torture, often the molding of a victim into a perpetrator, and the alteration of identity from victimized person to perpetrator. And it usually involves a religious or political ideology to consolidate this transformation. This play really articulates this process in a way that no other play or film that I've ever heard of or read does. And by articulating it so clearly, it raises our awareness about the universality of this phenomenon. I think the bottom line, the painful bottom line, is that most trauma survivors, especially those who've experienced torture, mind control, or captivity, feel unbelievably isolated, alienated, and misunderstood by society, so that when and if they manage to re-enter society, either through the legal system, the criminal justice system, or the mental health system, there's a high likelihood that they will be misunderstood, re-traumatized, and that their direct experience will be once again eviscerated by those in positions of help, healing, or justice. So one of the things this play really underscores is the vulnerability of those who are already traumatized to more traumatization in our social systems that are not really sophisticated yet enough to truly understand their experience and help them recover from this type of trauma. I left out the media, but the media is really a big force of re-traumatization of trauma survivors, whether it's a rape victim whose story is misrepresented by the media, and then that rape victim has to get all this flack from people in their world because the way it was represented in the media was distorted, or somebody like Patty Hearst, who was her story was internationally known. So the level of projection, distortion, and misrepresentation of her experience assumed a mythological and archetypal level. Patty was taught in her perpetrator group, her criminal political perpetrator group, that the mainstream society would kill her. And of course, the mainstream society did enact those dynamics towards her. So there was a real corroboration between the paranoid training of the indoctrinating group and what society played out with this particular trauma survivor. It's often the same thing, where many people who come out of these groups and are saved or protected are then subjected to unbelievable amounts of injustice, misunderstanding, and social ostracism. Or, contrary, heralded as some kind of hero, which also doesn't do justice to their own internal struggles. So I think this play really exposes that kind of tendency of society to re-traumatize survivors. Although it's counterintuitive that a play that deals with themes of trauma and redemption and re-traumatization, such as this, would be done in a musical form, it's a credit to the message that this play, the set of messages that this play is delivering, that it's done through music and lyrics and in a poetic, kind of almost Shakespearean form of communication. Because I think we're so used to hearing stuff in the news about topics like this, that if our right brain is not engaged in experiencing the suffering, tragedy, trauma, dilemmas, and triumphs of the characters in the story, we might not be as deeply moved as we are because it's done through music. You know, often the patterns of musical theater tend to be light and airy and take people away from understanding human suffering and the human condition. But the beauty of this play, being done in musical form, is that it brings the depth of the human experience to our right brain and our left brain simultaneously, and the nuance and aesthetic and sensitivity of the lyrics and the music make it an absolutely more profound experience, so that nobody can walk away from this without having almost a surround sound, visceral experience of many dimensions of human struggle, human tragedy, human condition, and human transcendence.